It's time now for Perspective, and my guest today is Juliette Démas, London correspondent for the French daily Libération. She is the author of a new book which has just been published in France, Les affamés du Royaume, or The Famished of the Kingdom in English. It looks at the poverty crisis in the United Kingdom, with an increasing number of people relying on food banks, exacerbated by years of austerity measures, Brexit, the COVID-19 pandemic and inflation. Good morning, Juliette, and thank you for joining us today. Can I start by asking what moved you to write this book?
Well, I moved to London in September 2022 as a foreign correspondent. And I think this position is important because when you come from outside, you bring a vision, you bring a preconception of what the country should be like. You have expectations, usually based on how the country is perceived internationally. And you come with an intention to understand the psyche and the challenges of a country. And at the end of 2022, the whole country, the whole UK seemed to be at a stop. There were lots of strikes. Inflation was above 11%. The energy bills were very, very high. So this reality didn't align with my expectations. And as a journalist, I started working on stories on warm banks or food banks put in place by the NHS for the staff. And all of that really shocked me. All we were talking about were the cost of living crisis, having to choose between keeping warm and eating. And it just didn't make any sense that the UK would suffer so much more than other countries. So I think this shock and the comparison between this really dire reality and the quite relaxed political discourse informed the creation of this book.
Now, the crisis has been, it's been general for some years now. Have you observed it all over the UK, or is it notably worse in certain regions?
Well, I used to live in Northern Ireland and I saw a lot of poverty there, but I thought it was more linked with the war, the very specific political situation, and a lack of opportunity. So as I moved to London, I thought things would be better, but they are not, and they are everywhere. I think there are like 43 food banks in my borough of London. And there's some places where you see it more, like seaside towns or places in Scotland or the north of England. But it's everywhere, it's overall. And if you don't want to see it, you won't see it because it can be hidden. You can think that the people queuing in front of churches are just waiting for mass.
Now, the poverty crisis is probably best exemplified by those food banks. They've almost become a symbol of social malaise over the past 15 years. Who organises the food banks and operates them?
There's different networks. One of the networks is the Trussell Trust, and they started in the early 2000s. And when they started, they really didn't expect it to become that big. So what's interesting about the food banks is that they have become a sort of parallel network to get food. So you can exchange time and dignity against tins of food, or you can exchange money if you work and you can go to the supermarket. And I think that's really interesting because that's one of the aspects of the crisis that's the most shocking. It's how humiliating it is and how it removes people. It takes the choice away from people. And it's depressing. That's why people don't fight back that much, because they have internalized the fact that they shouldn't be given a choice.
And there have been high-profile instances of perhaps, for want of a better word, celebrities such as the footballer Marcus Rashford, who organised campaigns to get free meals in schools. Has it really been left to the private sector, so to speak, in order to pick up the slack on this, where the government is not doing its job?
Well, as I was saying, the government's quite relaxed on that. And there's been a discourse welcoming the use of food banks because it shows that people have compassion. That was one of the big aspects of my research, because people find solutions. The private sectors is giving money, is investing in food banks, is giving food surpluses, but no one is asking for a public solution. And when you talk to social workers, they say that's the only type of solution that is going to change things on a longer term, like on the daily basis. You have enough volunteers and enough companies interested in just giving a little bit of money, giving a little bit of food, but more generally, you need the state to do something.
And I imagine that many more social problems have sort of spread out from this widespread poverty.
social problems, but also really visible effects of austerity, because everything has been cut. You have less buses, you have less school buses, the museums are closing, the tourist information centers are closing, you have parks closing, like less street lights. So there's a full erosion of standards of living. And because it's been very slow over 15 years, people have gotten used to it. They've done with it or without. And when you start looking at what the country was like 15 years ago, it was in a much better position.
Now, anti-poverty activists have laid the blame for the crisis at the door of the Conservatives, which is understandable given they were in government for 14 years. But since last July, there's been a change in government in the UK. We've seen yesterday that Keir Starmer's government is going to cut benefits by £5 million. Is it going to be more of the same under Labour?
There's a real fear there's going to be more of the same. Before the elections, I went to Nottingham, which is a Labour town, a Labour city, and people didn't have much hope. They said it would be more of the same, more of red austerity. And what hasn't changed since Labour has arrived is the narrative that there isn't enough money to give to people. People don't deserve to be helped, and there just isn't an incentive to just give them what they need to live in dignity.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the UK did seem to be particularly unique in this instance of having such widespread food poverty. Can you see this sort of problem spreading to elsewhere in Europe, including here in France?
It does, and we have the same food bank problem, but what was different about the UK is it's been growing over 15 years. So the problem is more recent on the continent, whereas in the UK, because benefits have been cut and public services have been cut since 2010, it's more visible and it's a few years ahead of the rest of the continent.
Thank you very much for that, Juliette Démas, whose book Les affamés du Royaume is available in French now.